Alright, so to bring home more fully some of the concepts we looked at last week in Lecture 4, I want to do one more demonstration, and that is what I call stopwatch. So we're going to create an app that basically does basic stopwatch functionality. So turn our iPhone into a stopwatch. And we're going to do this in Swift, so I'm going to go ahead and start Xcode and create a new Xcode project. And I'm going to select a single view application. And I've got iOS selected here, so we'll go with single view. And I'll call this my stopwatch demo. And we'll leave everything else default. And let me put this in its proper place. Alright, so I've just created a single view app. We've done this many times, and when we run this thing, it just pops up with a blank screen. There's nothing on there. So the very first step is to create the basic UI of our stopwatch. And so I'm going to go into the storyboard, and front and center in this app is going to be the elapsed time kind of in a big font right in the middle of the screen. So I'm going to use a text label for that. So I'm going to drag a text label onto my storyboard. Let me just make this screen a little bigger. And I'll put that kind of in the center of the screen, and then I'm going to stretch it out. And we haven't talked about getting all the layout to work right on different size screens and all that, and some of you have asked me some questions, and that's another topic I've been kind of deliberately pushing off, but I hope to hit that one as well on Thursday. We'll start talking about that. So for now, I'm just going to assume this is going to look good on an iPhone 6 in portrait orientation. So I'm going to increase the font size on that label. So I'll go over here to the attributes inspector, and instead of this 17, I'm going to move it up to 44. It's going to be real big, and I'll make it bold as well. Okay, and then I'm going to change the default label so it looks like a stopwatch. So the clear value is going to be hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. Okay, so there's my time. And the other thing I'm going to do here is drag some controls out to the screen. So these are buttons, and I'm going to position them down here in the bottom. And I'm going to have 3 of them total. And I'll give them some names respectively. So this very first button, what I want to do is have kind of a modal display where if I'm out in the bright sun, I might want a nice white screen with black. And if I'm maybe in the dark, I don't want to have this blinding bright light. So I want to kind of switch the orientation and make it dark. So I want to have night mode. So by default, it'll come up in day mode, which is dark foreground, light background. But when I click this night button, it's going to switch to night mode, which will basically make a black background with a white foreground. So I'm just going to play around with that. So I'll toggle the label on that button as I click it. So when initially it's going to come up as night, and when I click it, it's going to switch. It's going to kind of do the reverse video, if you will, and then when the button title will change to day, and so it'll just toggle like that. So we'll start with night. The middle button I'm going to use to just start the clock timing. So we'll call this the start button. And once again, when it's started, we're going to change this control to say pause. So I can actually start the timer, let it go for a little while, then pause it, just hold it, but keep my value, and then start it again to add on to it. All right? And then obviously the last thing I'm going to need here is a clear button. And the clear button just says, you know what, zero out my elapsed time, and let's just get going. and we'll restart it. So let me just, I'm not doing auto layout yet, so let me just run this and see if it looks reasonably good. Okay, I can stretch it out a little bit more here. So we'll make this go a little further, I guess. Yeah, we'll just leave it. We're gonna fix this next week and make it look good, but for now we'll just get the functionality out there, which is good enough. Now I'm gonna need some outlets for some of these guys. What are the outlets for again? Does anybody remember? Yeah, it basically gives me access, doesn't it, to the items inside my controller code, so I can programmatically access them and manipulate them. And I would like outlets on all of these guys actually, because I need to get at the label, because I'm going to be running a timer that's going to update that label every few milliseconds, and I want to update my night button. I want to toggle it to day, and my start button I want to toggle it to pause, and my clear button, you know, I'd like to deactivate it at times when it doesn't make sense to clear, when it's already cleared or whatever. So I need an outlet for each, so I'm going to go over here and pull up my assistant editor, and we've seen this before, and I'm just going to start creating outlets. And remember, we just control click and then drag over there. So the very first one will just be my display label, and that's my text up on the screen. And let's go to this button next, and we'll call this my mode button, because it's going to let me switch between display modes. And we'll have a start button here that we'll simply call the start button. And then we'll need the clear button, which we'll also call the clear button. Alright, so I've got an outlet now to each one of those guys, and those will give me access to these in the controller code down below as I start to do stuff. I also need a model for this particular application, and so for a model, I'm going to create myself a new class. So I'll say File New, and we'll go with a Swift file, and I'll just call this my model. And it'll be a new class. So we'll define it as a struct actually, because I don't really need inheritance behavior here. So I'm going to call this my model. And it's going to have a number of variables. It's going to capture the start time, which is going to be of type NSDate. So this is a foundation class, and it's used by iOS to represent dates. And you can go read the documentation. Incidentally, if you're in Xcode and you hold the Option key, when you move over framework classes or framework method names, you'll see it highlight like this, and if we click, we can actually pull up a brief summary of what that class is, and we can also go into the reference documentation. So there we are within the documentation that I've downloaded. Okay, so that's kind of a nice handy function there when you're working with framework classes. You can have another variable called pause time. And this, when you hit the pause button, we need to stop the elapsed time from incrementing. And so the pause time I'm going to use just to model when that pause button was actually pressed. And I'm going to have a variable to represent which mode that I'm in. And I'm going to make that to be a Boolean. So I'll call it night mode. So whenever I'm in night mode, this thing's going to be true, otherwise it's going to be false. And I'm going to initialize it to false since I'm in day mode to begin with. And I'm going to have another variable called timing, and it's also Boolean. And this variable is simply going to represent whether or not the timer is activated. Okay, so whether or not I'm actually updating the display. So I'm basically, when I hit the start button, I'm going to turn this on. It says, okay, now you're actively timing. And then the last member variable that I want here is I'm going to create a timer object. And that's also a foundation class, and it's of type NSTimer. Okay, and we'll look at some of the functionality, but this will give me the capability to say, all right, start a timer, and on certain intervals, call back a method that I'm going to give it. All right, so I'm obviously going to set up a time quantum here, and I'm going to start this timer, and then it's going to go off and asynchronously call this method periodically, and that's going to update my screen. All right, so we need a initializer here to initialize these guys. So we're just going to set these to some values for now. I could probably make them optionals and just set them to nil. That would probably be a better thing to do here. So there's my model. And having defined the model, I'm going to add a property for my model, and I'm going to put that in my view controller. So my view controller is going to instantiate the model, and it's going to have a property where it holds that value. So we'll go back here, and we will define this thing as a property. So we'll just say var myModel, which is of type myModel. And we can just define it right here. So we'll just call the initializer right here. So now I've got my model instantiated and defined. And we're going to go down into the, well, actually we've already got the timing property set to false. So I think we're good at this point. Let's start wiring up our buttons to IB action so that when you push the buttons we can actually get things cranking here. So we'll go back into the storyboard and into the assistant editor, and we're going to have several buttons. So we'll add an action to the clear button. So we want an action, and the sender type is a UI button, and we're going to call this clear timer, and we connect it. So when that button's pressed, we're going to end up here, and then we're going to have our toggle timer. Or maybe just start button. Start timer. So once again, it's an action. So type UI button. And then the last one is also an action. And we'll call it toggle night mode. Okay. All right, the very first thing I'm going to do is I need to start up my timer right when the view appears. Okay, so when the view appears, users are going to start interacting with this thing and pressing buttons. And so I'm going to override my view did appear, and I'm going to set up that timer so that it calls back a method that I give it periodically at a fixed resolution. So we're going to say override func view did appear, And the first thing we do is we call our superclass viewDidAppear. And having done that, now we can set up our model's timer the way we want it to be set up. So we'll say this guy's stopwatch timer is going to be a new timer. Let me get myself some more screen here. So we're going to call a constructor on NSTimer that takes a time interval, a target, a method on that target. So we want this last one right here. So the time interval is going to be this, so I'm just going to put a fraction in here. I believe this is in milliseconds. It could be seconds. We'll have to look at the documentation. Oops, this is not what I wanted. Okay, I got the wrong one, but I want a target, which is going to be self, and that followed by a selector. And the selector, the selector is just the method name. And the way we handle these in Swift is we use the string, which is actually the name of that. Then we have user info, which we don't care about. And then finally, we have repeats, which we're going to set to true. So let me get this to span some lines here. So there it is. And now I need to define that particular function. So I'm going to come down here and say funct update timer, and the timer, this is the method that's going to be called periodically by this timer object. And what I want to do here is I want to figure out, am I timing or not? If I'm updating the display, I'm going to do some computations and figure out how much elapsed time and update it. Otherwise, I'm just going to exit and do nothing. So that's the timer, but now I've got to actually get this thing to run. So to do that, I need to add this timer to my current run loop. So to do that, we can say, and this is just stuff I researched to figure this out. So we'll take the current run loop and we'll add the timer that we just created. For mode ns run common mode. Alright, so now every time, once I start, it's going to be periodically calling this function. And we can validate that perhaps by just putting a piece of code here. And then I'll put a breakpoint on it. And let's go ahead and run this thing. Okay, notice I'm in the break position, and if I continue, I end up right back there again. Okay, so that's working just fine. So let's go ahead and implement this function. What we want to do here is, if we are timing, okay, so if we've started the timer, if we've hit the start button, then we want to compute how much time has elapsed since that button was pressed. So I need to do a number of date calculations here. So the first thing I want to do is check and see if I'm running. And remember, we represented that in our model with this timing boolean. So if this thing is true, then we're going to be in timing mode and we need to update this display. So how do we do that? Well, we first of all get the current date. So we get an NSDate object, and it turns out when we say, if we just call the constructor, it gives us a timestamp of right now. Then I need to compute the amount of time that's elapsed. So I need to compute a time interval from when the start button was pressed to the current time. So that's a time interval. So I'm going to define a variable called time interval, and it's of type NS time interval. And it turns out there's a method on the date object that will give us this. So if we have a date, we can ask it for a time interval since and give it, so since date right here, and give it another date. And so the other date here is going to be the date that the button was pressed on. So it's my model.start time. Okay, so this simply says, okay, this is the time that's elapsed since your start button was pressed. Alright, so now I need to do some formatting here to get this thing to look right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compute the amount of time from beginning of time, okay, so the beginning of my time epoch to this time interval out. So that's what I'll call my timer date, because that's what I want up there, right? So I want to convert this thing back into a time, this time interval. And I'm going to set it at the beginning of the time epoch, which is 1970. So we can say this. We could say timer date is going to be equal to an NS date, and we can call time interval since 1970 and give it that time interval that we just computed. Now we can format the date. So I'll create myself a date formatter. And that's called NSDate formatter. And we need to set the GMT time zone on this. So we're basically normalizing our time zone. And our abbreviation is GMT. And then we're going to set the actual format string. So we say date formatter dot set localized data format from template, and my template is going to be the format that I've got it up on the screen. Then I can say var time string, which is going to be of type string, is equal to date formatter string from date timer date. Alright, so now that I've got that, now I can actually go and update that label that's on the screen. And that was called display label. Okay, so if I did everything right, when I start the timer, every time I get called, it's going to update based on those calculations. So I think to just do a quick test here, we could simply turn that timer on when you hit the start button. Now I don't have stop and everything implemented. That's probably a good idea at this point to just test our logic, and let's just turn that timer on when you hit the start button. So if you go down here in the start button, we simply want to say a self.myModel.timing equal true, and then we want to say self.myModel.startTime equals NS date. Okay, so that'll start it at the right time. So let's go ahead and run this and see if it works. Alright, so everything's good so far. And then we'll hit the start button, and sure enough, it takes off and it's updating the date. Okay, now I don't have any kind of functionality in here to do anything else, so now we got to implement the rest of this to get it fully working. So let's go ahead and implement that start button press more fully. So what we want to do here is, first of all, we want to check what mode we're in. So I could say, I could actually look at the label on that button. I could say, if my mode button's title label, and remember, we need to unwrap it, so I'm going to put the bang there. So if this guy's text is equal to night, okay, then we know we're in day mode. Okay, so we want to swap to night mode. So the first thing we need to do is update that mode button to say day. So we'll say the mode button, and then we'll call set title, and the title here will be day, and the state is UI control state normal. Okay, so the button's normal state label is going to be day, and then we need to sorry, I'm on the wrong, I'm doing the wrong thing. Let me just push this on the stack. I actually want this, so instead of relying on my mind, I'm using my notes and reading from the wrong function. So let me start this all over again. So if I'm timing, when you press the start button, the most interesting thing is, am I timing or not? So I'm going to say if self.myModel.timing. So if this is true, then I know that button's got to say pause on it. Okay, because if the timer's already going, we're going to switch it to pause. So if that's the case, then we want to capture the pause time, because that's what they just did. So we'll say myModel.pauseTime is equal to right now. Then we want to toggle this variable, so self.myModel.timing is going to be false. And then we want to toggle the value on that button. So the start button right now says pause, and we want it to say start. And for state, normal. Okay, that takes care of that. And I'm also now going to enable my clear button, because what I'm doing is I'm starting the timer right now. I got a non-zero value in there. I should be able to clear it. So I'm going to say self.clear button enabled equals true. Okay, if we aren't timing already, then we want to start timing. So we're going to turn that model timer on to true, and we're going to capture a start time only it's not as simple as that, because if they pause, okay, if they pause, think about the logic here. I start at a certain time, I run for 10 seconds, then I pause, then I start again. I want to reduce from the accumulated time the amount of time I've paused. Okay, so it's a little bit tricky. So I need to do that. So we set the timer to true, but the first thing to do is find out what state are we in. We're starting. Are we starting from scratch with 0 on our timer, or do we got some leftover time that we're going to start accumulating onto again? And the way I chose to do that was just a simple if statement, and I can look at that display label, because the display label has all zeros in it if I'm in a fresh start mode. So I can say if my display label text is equal to that initial string, hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds. So if it's equal to this, okay, then I know that I'm in that special mode where the easy case, where I simply say, okay, start time is right now. The else side of this is a little bit more complicated. So if I've got previous time accumulated, I need to keep track of how long I was paused, and I need to remove that. So I need to adjust the start time to take that into account. Okay? So we'll do some more computation. So I'm going to get the current date. So the current date is right now. And once again, I'm going to do a time interval. Based on the current date and the amount of time that I've paused. So that gives me the amount of time I've paused. And now I'm going to compute the start time by taking that into account. So I'll say my start time is going to be equal to my start time, but I can call this method date by adding time interval and pass in that time interval. Okay, so that way I'm actually getting, I'm adding that, taking into account that time I was paused. Alright, I'm still in the else branch, so the last thing we need to do here is set the title on that button to toggle. So the title here is now going to be pause, because we're running. And the clear button, we're going to de-able it, because we don't want this thing running or available while we're running. So I'm going to deactivate that. And that should do the job. And I got an extraneous thing there. Okay, so with a little luck, we should now be able to start and stop our timer. So we'll start it. Okay, notice what happened there.
The string got too long for the label.
The string got too long for the label, so iOS automatically abbreviated with these dots. Okay, so the easy fix for that is to simply make it a little bit bigger in Interface Builder. Now we'll do these layouts right in the future, but for now let's just kind of hack it up. And that one's going to be shorter, so that's good. So let's try this again. So we start it, and now it's correct. It says pause. So if I pause, it stops, and now my start button is back up. And if I press start again, it continues. And notice how my clear button is enabling and disabling based on the state of the other button. Okay, so let's hook up the clear button. So the clear button is easy. All we need to do here is what? Simply set that label, because we know we're stopped, otherwise we won't be able to push this thing. So all we really got to do is say self.displayLabel.text is equal to hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds. Alright, so check that out. pause, clear. Okay, last thing we're going to do is we want to hook up that night mode button so we can flip around the display. And we started that a few minutes ago. So let's go finish that. So toggle night mode button is going to basically do the reverse video depending on what state we're in. So if the button says night, that means we're in day mode and we want to switch over to night mode. So I'm going to change the text on the button so that toggles. And then I need to flip my view background to be black and my foreground to be white. Okay, so I can do that very simply by saying self, and every view controller has a property called view, which gets set by the framework for us, that represents the root view of our view hierarchy. Okay, so it's the container that has all this. So I'm going to say this view is going to get a background color of black. And then we want to take that label, the display label, and have it display as white. So I'll say self.display label text color is equal UI color white color. Else, okay, so if we're in, if the text on that thing says day, that means we're actually in night mode. So we're going to toggle the button. So these are almost the same. So I'm going to cut and paste here. And this one will say night. And this one will say white color. And this one will say black color. Alright, so let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so everything's good. It's ticking away. Okay, does that look good?
So for maybe the visibility of the buttons.
Yeah, that could be done a little better. They're still visible. I don't care about that one. There's something more nagging. So we could play with the button attributes too and do that. Does anybody see anything else that bothers you? Ah, the status bar. Okay, that's a problem. Okay, and that would kind of stink if, you know, here you are in the middle of the night and you can't see if your battery's going dead or if you got a signal, or so we got to fix that. We can't be. It's actually there. It's just black, so it's black on black, and we can't really see it. Okay, so let's kill this thing, and it turns out the framework will actually, so that status bar is actually kind of outside of our app. It's being updated by the system software, but we can play around with the styling of that status bar. So if we've got a different color back, like the black background, we can actually flip that thing around as well. And it turns out there is a framework method that we can override on view controller. It's called preferred status bar style. So we can override that. I'm going to go up here where the other overrides are, and we'll say override, and the function name is preferred status bar style, and it returns a US status bar style. And so what we can do is we can check that mode button, and we can say, hey, if this thing is daytime, then we want to go with the default, which is the black on white, and if it's the other, then we'll use what's called light content. So I'm going to be a little bit defensive here. I'm going to say if my mode button is equal to nil, just in case, okay, or okay, if this mode button is actually mapped to something, okay, so there's my conditional unwrap that we talked about, then I'm going to check if this thing is day. Okay, if this is true, then I'm going to return UI bar style status bar. default. Else, I'm going to return UI status bar style.light content. Okay, now there's one other thing I got to do. This thing's only going to get called at certain points in time, and when I push that button, this method is not going to get called. I need to force the framework to kind of ask me, what should I do with that status bar? So down here, when we do that mode toggle, I'm going to force the status bar to get refreshed by calling this function set needs status bar appearance update. Okay, so if I call that down every time that mode button is pressed, that's going to force that thing to be refreshed. And before it refreshes, it's going to ask the current view controller, the root view controller, hey, what do you want to do with that status bar? So this will give it the hint. So now if we run it, okay, we're off and running. And now if I toggle, you can actually see that it's doing the right thing.